Hello, and welcome to the Publishing Executive and Book Business webinar, 5 Factors Affecting Scholarly Publishing Workflow, sponsored by Senveo Publisher Services. My name is Dennis Wilson, Editor-in-Chief of Publishing Executive and the host for today's event. Before we get started, let me take a second to point out the Tips for Attendees widget on your console. It's the blue icon with a wrench on it. If you missed the Tech Tips video we played leading up to the webinar, you can always click on this widget for more information. I also wanted to remind everyone that you can submit questions through the Q&A box throughout the webinar, and we'll try to get to as many of these questions as we can during the Q&A portion near the end. So now let's get to the program for today. Since the birth of web publishing, scholars and researchers have yearned to have their ever-growing knowledge more accessible to the scientific community and the broader public. Yet achieving a world of free-flowing scholarly information requires staying up to date on important technical challenges. Today's webinar will discuss several factors affecting scholarly publishing workflows and what publishers need to know to stay ahead of these changes. Our speakers will cover an overview of important metadata trends, including bibliographic, references, funding, licensing, and more, latest developments with institutional identifiers, challenges, and best practices when it comes to identifier metadata and publishing workflows, and we'll hear how the Society of American Foresters is using metadata. I'd also like to mention that Senveo Publisher Services has also published a free white paper that addresses many of the themes and topics that will be covered today. It's called All Things Connected, 5 Factors Affecting the Scholarly Publishing Workflow, and discusses workflow and metadata systems scholarly publishers have implemented to manage the digital versions of their articles. The link to download this white paper can be found through the resource widget on your webinar console. And now let's turn to our speakers. We have 3 fantastic speakers joining us today. And let me just take a minute to introduce each one of those. First, we have Chuck Kosher, Director of Technology at Crossref. Chuck has been the Director of Technology at Crossref since 2002. His primary responsibility has been in the development and operation of Crossref's core services and technical infrastructure. As a senior staff member, he also contributes to the definition of Crossref's mission and the expansion of its services, such as the launch of funding data, formerly known as FundRef. His role includes management of technical support and back-end business operations. Next, we have Evan Owens, VP Publishing Technologies at Senveo Publisher Services. Evan is a recognized leader serving the scholarly publishing community with editorial production and technology solutions. He has been working in academic publishing for 30 years, including the University of Chicago Press, Portico JSTOR, and AIP Publishing. He has been active in information standards, digital preservation, and industry organizations and initiatives, including Crossref, NISO, and Chorus. And finally, we have Jennifer Kuhn, Senior Managing Editor for the Society of American Foresters. Jennifer is Senior Managing Editor in Bethesda, Maryland, where she oversees the workflow for 2 scientific journals and is structuring a relaunch of the Society's book program. Her background in scholarly publishing has also covered medical and engineering titles. Jennifer's particular areas of interest and expertise include copyright, metadata, process improvement, co-publication and co-marketing, marketing of scholarly content, and leveraging scholarly publications to support associations' mission-based strategic plans. So thanks to all 3 of you for joining us today. And so I will now turn it over to Chuck to get things started.
Thanks, Dennis. So welcome, everyone. I'm assuming everyone pretty much knows what Crossref is and who we are, that we're a membership organization that operates as a nonprofit in the scholarly communication world. And so we'll just kind of dive into my presentation. I'm going to talk mainly about metadata, and metadata is essentially a very key element to all the things that move around within the scholarly framework and infrastructure right now, and we really need to all be paying particular attention to the detail of it all. So we'll touch on basic bibliographic metadata. I'm going to talk specifically a little bit in detail about funding, about Crossref and ORCID, Crossmark, which is one of the services that Crossref offers. Talk a little bit about how we work with our publishers and trying to help them do a good job of supplying the metadata, and then I'll finish with a few words on institutional identifiers and what's going on in the Crossref world there. So Crossref was started a long time ago, 14 years or 15 years ago, and it was primarily all about linking references. So people pretty much associate Crossref with DOI and linking of bibliographic references. And in many cases, we're operating behind the scenes and don't really have a high profile. But one of the things that really has emerged over the years is a recognition that Crossref is, in fact, a metadata distribution point. And we collect metadata from thousands of publishers across the community, as well as other entities that operate in our space, including social media, Wikipedia, and things of that nature. And this metadata all feeds in through some of the Crossref infrastructure and then gets pushed out to other places. We have a couple of very tight integration with ORCID and DataCite, who are a couple other players in the identifier landscape. But then, for the most part, our metadata gets pushed out into a lot of different places. There are subscribers to our metadata. There's a general public that pulls our metadata, and they use it for a large variety of things. And it's very important that this metadata be accurate and be kept up to date so that what they are attempting to do can be successful. So that's one of the messages that I hope you take away from this talk about the value of why metadata is important, why we want to pay attention to it. Back at Crossref's annual meeting in November last year in Boston, Jennifer Lynn, who's a director at Crossref, coined or mentioned the phrase the scholarly map. And what this really refers to is a reflection on what people are expecting out of our content now. The basic content is, of course, still critically important, but of more importance lately is the relationship of the content to other things that are in the ecosystem. And so we have the notion of an article, a version of record. It may have a preprint. It may have a translation. Articles and the research behind them is based on data, and maybe in the article may be composed of pieces like figures and tables, and maybe supplemental material. Articles, of course, have authors, and authors have affiliations. Authors can be identified with their own identifier, an ORCID, hopefully. Then we have important information about an article. It may have been updated. It may have been retracted. Articles can be funded by organizations, and that's a linkage that needs to be established. Articles may be part of a clinical trial, or that is the research that's associated with the article may have been part of a clinical trial. And identifying what that clinical trial registry is important. And so what we are seeing is that articles are bound to one another by their traditional sense, that being the relationships between them as expressed in their bibliography. But more importantly is emerging a new kind of map that couples together all of the various aspects and players and participants in the generation of that article. And these things, more and more, need to be linked. People expect them to be linked, easily located and navigable. And so metadata is kind of the key to all of this. And I'm going to touch on a few of the more important ones, as I said in the agenda. And so let's dive into that a little bit now. So accurate and complete metadata, as I've said, is really critically important. And metadata is the gasoline that makes the engine run. So let's move on. So basic bibliographic metadata. You'll see there in the box a citation, and this is a fairly typical citation style. I pulled this right off of the PLOS website. And so, this is an online journal. It's presented in an online fashion. But yet you can see that the citation is still kind of old-fashioned in that the author names have their initials are listed instead of their full names. The journal is abbreviated, PLOS Bio instead of biology. There's this 14-7 in there. I'm assuming that's volume and issue name. These are all very old-fashioned style of monikers that identified the journal. And yes, these things are still used quite heavily, so it's still important to capture them correctly and to have them correctly fed into the metadata stream of that starts with sending the data down to Crossref. Crossref now accepts abstracts for as part of the metadata submittal. So that's another feature, another part of the metadata stream we'd like to provide. We're also, we really encourage people to deposit the full set of references. When you deposit the references with the article, you're helping to establish the who cites who relationship or the who cites who map that Crossref maintains as a service. And then there's things like access indicators and access and license indicators. These are things that have emerged over the past couple of years. NISO and JAX are players in this space. JAX being the group that defines the XML formatting and XML style and markup language for journal composition. And so these things are tags that help a reader or help a researcher understand the terms under which the article can be utilized. So we've grown the concept of what is metadata from this basic bibliographic metadata to this much more inclusive and much richer set of metadata. What this really will mean in the long run is that our workflows have got to reflect accurate ways of capturing and recording this data. So let's talk a little bit specifically about funding. This emerged several years ago by funding bodies recognizing that, or by publishers actually recognizing that they could help funding bodies track their research and record what was the outcome of their research. And so publishers are in a good position to be able to do this as a stopover spot between the author and the funder. And so the primary problem was there wasn't much standardization in this. So Crossref introduced FundRef, as it was called, and now we just refer to it as funding data. So this service is essentially a set of metadata that someone provides to help describe who are the funders. So the problem is, here's an article and here's an acknowledgement section. This is typically how funding was acknowledged. It's you can't mine it, you can't really identify exactly what the funding statement in the acknowledgement is trying to say. So, people can find this stuff and read it, but machines certainly cannot. Even if the XML that the article is tagged up in has some breakdown of composition for the acknowledgement. Here you see the acknowledgement simply tagged in a paragraph tag. Well, that's nice, but not terribly helpful from an automation point of view. And so we need to get a connection between the funders and the publishers, and that's what Crossref funding data is all about. Excuse me. So it starts with a taxonomy of funding body names that Crossref maintains. We call it the Open Funder Registry. It's freely available for anyone to use. It is a list of names that was donated originally by Elsevier and is maintained by Elsevier. We feed back to Elsevier suggested names or candidate names on a regular basis. And so the list of names grows. If you take a look at this file, you'll see a lot more information other than a name. There are alternate names. There are accepted or recognized abbreviated names. There's information that describes the locale, the geographic location of the organization. And so there's a lot of information in this file that tries to identify who, in fact, the organization is and differentiate them from one another. There are a lot of organizations that have, identical or nearly identical acronyms or abbreviations, and a lot of times the names are very similar, only differentiated by the country in the name. And so the registry is incredibly useful as an organization identifier for funders, and we've assigned a DOI to those funding records. So feel free to go there and download this registry and have a look at it. And so what happens is Crossref maintains the registry. We supply the registry to the publisher. Publishers then use the registry in their production systems to identify, using the identifier, who is the funder for that given work. And that typically requires either mining by the publisher systems or by having the author directly enter the value into the production system or to the manuscript submittal system. Crossref then ingests that data, processes it, and makes it available to the wide scholarly community for mining and distribution and searching. And so, as I said, it's either the authors or the publishers having to actually find the information and supply the metadata. And so in the end, what you have is a searchable set of metadata. And so here's a service that Crossref provides where you can enter in the name of a funding body, in this case the National University of Ireland, Galway, and find the articles that were produced based on the funding supplied by that institution. And so this is the kind of thing that funders have been looking for a long time. It helps everyone satisfy the mandates that are out there. And in general, it just helps researchers and program managers and everyone else in the scholarly food chain do their work to mine through the data. So that's funding data. The next thing I'll talk about is a little bit is ORCID. ORCID is an organization where people can go register, get an account, and get an identifier. So they've got an identifier, and one of the key things about ORCID is that we want to have user profiles, or the researcher profiles in ORCID, fully populated with the list of works that that author has produced. Imagine that someone is reading an article, they see who the author is, and they would like to look at other things published by that author. So if the metadata that Crossref has contains the ORCID for that user, the reader can then navigate to that ORCID's profile and actually determine what other works they've published. So the way that this works is the publisher deposits the metadata to Crossref, which includes the ORCID for a given user. Crossref then asks for permission from that user to automatically update their profile. And once the author actually gives permission to Crossref, Crossref will then and forevermore push works automatically to that user's profile as we receive the metadata from publishers that contain that user's ORCID. And so it's an auto update process based on the metadata that originates at the publisher that has to include the ORCID. So it's very important for that step to be part of the workflow for publishers. This is a little bit dated. It's probably 2 months old, but it's going along well. We've pushed a couple 100,000 works to our ORCIDs, have around 500 publishers participating, and we've reached out to over 250,000 authors at this point in time. We are investigating and working on, and a little bit puzzled over the conversion rate there. It's a little bit lower than we'd like, but it's early in the game yet, so we're hoping to improve that figure in the near future. Crossmark is another aspect that requires good metadata, and it's essentially a predictable interface for providing article status. So what do I mean by that? Well, articles do in fact change, and one of the things we absolutely do not want to do is just version an article in place. If a reader goes to a publisher's platform, reads an article one day, and goes to that very same page the next day, and the text is different, that's a very bad thing. We just want to avoid that at all costs. And so we make changes to version of records by addition, through addendums, through corrections, or through retractions. And what this traditionally looked like was you'd be on the page and you could click on the correction button. Well, Crossmark is a way to provide a uniform approach for this. And so essentially what you would see is the article with the Crossmark banner, which indicates that this is where you should look. Cross-publisher platforms to see anything new and interesting that you ought to be aware of with regard to that article. And then what gets displayed is a dialog box that in this case is telling you there is an update available for this article. There's a link to it. It has its own DOI. And of course, then you have the DOI for the original article that you were reading. So this requires metadata, and it's very important to have accurate metadata that describes these relationships. So one of the things that Crossref really wants to do is help our members do a good job. We're introducing this concept of participation reports either later this year or early next year, and it will provide a sort of a dashboard describing how well they're doing, what percentage of their DOIs have been assigned certain metadata. We issue reports to our members all the time indicating how many resolutions their DOIs have received, and we break down their resolutions by the journal title that they publish. So there's a lot of metadata, there's a lot of information around these systems now that is flowing back and forth between publishers and service providers that require someone paying attention to. For example, here's a report on a journal, and we've gone out and tested some number of those DOIs to see if they were good. And in this case, we tested 126 of the 1,103 DOIs in this journal, and 124 of them were confirmed. This is a good report. Some of them aren't so good. They're indicated by the writ dates, and that means someone has to take action and figure out what's going on. We also do supply our members quite regularly with a report on the quality of metadata that they're sending into us. And so this is a kind of just a cut and paste of a few of the reports, and it's indicating, for example, that for one of the DOIs, the page contains a dash, which probably means instead of a page, it's a page range. That's not a good thing. It's not really an accurate reflection of the metadata. We also have a number of anomalies associated with author names, and this report is trying to articulate what exactly is wrong with that metadata. The long and short of all of this is, again, there's a lot going on here, and there's a lot of work and attention that needs to be paid to the metadata stream. And so someone in the publisher workflow has got to be the recipient of this data and will take action to correct it. Organizational identifiers, we essentially have recognized through a lot of talk from the community that an open organization for organizational identifiers is still needed by the community. And so Crossref has had a lot of internal discussion about institutional identifiers, organizational identifiers. In November of this year, there's a thing called the Pitapalooza going to be taking place in Reykjavik. There's a link there to it, pitapalooza.org. It's essentially trying to bring everyone together in the community to talk about what's needed for organizational identifiers. Actually, identifiers in general. It's not just organizational identifiers. And here's a link to a draft requirements paper that is being worked on by these folks, which documents what we think is needed and what will come forward out of, hopefully, the Pitapalooza. And the last slide I have is essentially the message I want to leave you with, and that is that metadata is important. Hopefully I've described to you why it's important and how it gets used in the entire ecosystem. It can be technical. There's no getting around that. It's just complicated stuff, and it takes effort. And we really have to have it become an integral part of the workflow processes that we all have. That was my presentation. Now I'm going to turn it over to Evan.
Okay, so Chuck has given us a wonderful high-level perspective. I'm going to give us a detailed analysis of the workflow to support some of these metadatas. The two examples I'm going to use is ORCID authors and the FundRef funder IDs, and what are the challenges and best practices, and then from that speculate as to how that can help us support future metadata projects. So for this discussion at a high level, the pieces of a journal publishing workflow include author submission and peer review, production tasks, which could include text conversion and cleanup, copy editing, typesetting, XML full text creation, the author proof review, and the delivery of the finalized content and metadata for online publication and registration with Crossref. And all of these pieces are likely to be impacted by metadata workflow implementations. So moving metadata from peer review systems, previous slide, from peer review systems to production system is a common industry practice, and lots of those products are now using JATS XML for that external metadata transmission. And as Chuck mentioned, JATS is widely adopted for XML full text. So JATS is connected with a lot of these metadata things. So obviously workflow solutions can be very different based on the specifics of the metadata type. The source for the metadata can be external input from the author, or it can be found in the text by either author markup or extracted manually or algorithmically. And there can be serious mismatches between the externally submitted metadata and the article text, which is a serious workflow issue. The goal for most workflows is to store the metadata in the XML full text, so that has to be supported by the JATS standard. And some verification is essential to ensure the quality of the metadata. That is often part of the editing process. But author verification is also important. That's usually at the proof stage. So, talking about ORCIDs, the formal launch was in 2012, and the ORCID count is now over 2.3 million identities and growing steadily. And the major recent industry event was last fall when Crossref and ORCID built the connection that Chuck described to us. It's a great enhancement to our community. But recently, publishers and funding agencies have started requiring ORCID IDs, so industry adoption is increasing. As ORCID started, it was very clear that this was going to be an important innovation for scholarly publishing. So I suggested to the JATS committee that we add support for ORCID in JATS version 1.0. This was something new for the JATS committee, implementing markup to support what was then future publisher requirements, rather than just including things already done by publishers. So proactive rather than reactive. So what we added was the contrib ID element, which was a generic solution that would support any system of personal identifiers. As Crossref began its project of collecting ORCID, the Crossref metadata spec included not just the ORCID ID, but an attribute as to whether the ID had been authenticated. So we added that to JATS version 1.1 draft 2 in December 2014. But 1.1 wasn't formally approved until January of this year, so that was a challenge. So the sample JATS for this is very straightforward, just adding the contrib ID inside the contrib markup that was already there. So authenticate is an important concept in ORCID workflow. It means that the user logs into the ORCID system with an ORCID password, and then that confirms the match of user and ORCID ID. So an external system, like a peer review system, can then record that it was authenticated, and the ORCID ID can be reused, but the user only has to verify that once, log in once. So authenticated is not the same as metadata being confirmed or verified. In ORCID workflow terminology, authenticated is a special concept. So, Typical ORCID workflow. The most common current workflow is to collect an authenticated ORCID ID from the submitting author via the peer review system and then transfer that via external metadata files to production for incorporation into the XML full text. One logistical challenge is how and when to get the co-author's ORCID IDs, and would those also be authenticated or just manually entered? Some of the peer review systems support notifying co-authors to sign in and authenticate. That can be part of the submission process or at acceptance. Some common problems include typos in manually entered IDs and ORCIDs repeated across multiple authors due to errors in the peer review system. So verification is important. An interesting new ORCID workflow has appeared recently, as described by Laurel Hack from ORCID in her talk at JATSCon 2016, earlier this year. The Overleaf writing system supports gathering authenticated ORCID IDs from authors and then embedding that metadata into the exported XML full text. So a very elegant solution. And amusing, because historically we didn't get a lot of XML or SGML from authors, and now that's actually possible in one scenario. So the typical ORCID production-related tasks include using the ORCID API to look up and verify that an ID in the metadata is okay and not a typo. Connecting to the ORCID API also then returns the author name as per the ORCID profile, which then can be compared to the article metadata. But given that name forms vary and names can change, that may not be a definitive text correction, but it could become a query to the author. Why is the name different? So on. Taking the ORCID from an external metadata file and embedding it into the XML full text can be tricky, as the article metadata and the article full text are sometimes not perfectly synchronized. So embedding ORCIDs is like a combination of automated process and human review and problem resolution. At author peer review, a common practice is to add links based on the ORCID ID and then to query the author, asking the author to verify that the links are pointing to the correct ORCID author profile page, and so confirm the accuracy of the metadata. If during the proof process there are any further corrections or additions, anything manual changes, it's essential that those also be verified. So some ORCID issues in workflow. It's interesting is that although it is possible to do a name search against the ORCID database, that can often result in errors because there are multiple name instances, changed names, and name variations, which is why ORCID tells you not to do that, and why the ORCID ID was created in the first place, to resolve name ambiguities. So unless it is author confirmed, lookup metadata is potentially risky. There are 40 John Smiths in the ORCID database right now. An interesting industry issue is that the authenticated attribute still isn't widely implemented yet. At Senveo, we are seeing authenticated in the external article metadata from peer review systems, but most customers are not having us included in their XML full text yet, but likely will do so as the hosting vendors are now finally moving to the approved JAX 1.1. So now on to a second major workflow example, and that's the funding metadata, which was the FundRef project launched by Crossref in 2013. Funding metadata implementation has been a key component of the Chorus initiative, so lots of discussions on the Chorus technical working group. So the observations that I'm sharing with you are based on that community feedback as well as my own participation. So there are two very different ways to collect funding metadata. One is to have authors make selections via a peer review system user interface, so a database lookup based on the registry. That could be at submission or after acceptance. Then that metadata is commonly compared to the acknowledgements section of the article to check for discrepancies. That comparison can be done during peer review or more commonly during production as part of copy edit. The other source scenario is not author external input, but rather extracting the funding info from the acknowledgements section of the full text and then mapping that to the registry, and then having the author confirm that metadata mapping is correct. That confirmation is essential. So in the first solution, the UI-based, there have been a lot of challenges in collecting funding metadata via UI. Problems such as getting non-invalid names, misspellings, actual registry names not matched correctly to the registry IDs, and author input not matching their text well. So there's been a lot of industry discussion and experiments about UI enhancements to optimize this. One of the early ones was adding on-screen instructions telling the authors to make sure their metadata input matches the acknowledgement sections. That was a big improvement. Another was fixing a UI bug that allowed authors to type a name but not click on the list, and so you're getting names without IDs. The registry is so big that it can be challenging for authors as a drop-down list of the UI. One chorus member publisher has built a clever enhancement to their peer review system. Authors first see not the full registry, but a small sublist of funders most common to that discipline's journals so that they can easily find their most used funder names. But it also has the option to search the entire registry as needed. As Chuck has mentioned, the country information is really important. Showing the country information with the organization name is key to success. Names and acronyms are not unique. It's amusing how many National Science Foundations there are and how NSF can mean lots of many different things. In the other workflow model, which is extracting from the text of the acknowledgement sections, there's just a lot of issues because it doesn't easily match to the registry. So here's a list of some common problems and issues in mapping to the registry. I personally have looked at a lot of this kind of data over the last 3 years and worked on these matching rules. So as mentioned, names and acronyms are not unique, so it may not be obvious which one the author has mentioned. And there's lots of details of the name format that might not match the registry precisely. Amusing things like the could be present or added incorrectly. The name could be present and the acronym added or the acronym missing and not matching the registry preferred name format. And there can be textual errors like and or ampersand or for or of. And some registry entries do include names and comma and then the country, and sometimes authors add that, and so then it doesn't match exactly. And lots of spelling errors and capitalization problems. The amusing article I saw said Environment Protection Agency, not Environmental Protection Agency. And lots of name variants don't match the registry, and some of that is very possibly due to translation errors. So, for example, the registry says National Natural Science Foundation of China, but I saw one article that said National Natural Science Funds of China, and another that said National Natural Science Foundation of the People's Republic of China. So variants. Another registry name is Ministry of Health and Welfare Taiwan, but an article cited it as Department of Health Taiwan. Another registry name is Dutch Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sport. One article cited it as only Dutch Ministry of Health. So there's lots of potential mismatches. Some of this can be addressed by algorithms, and some of it has to be resolved by human review. But the bigger challenge is that authors in their acknowledgments can cite a funding program name rather than the funding agency name. For example, citing 973 program, which is an activity of the Chinese Ministry of Science and Technology, but it is not an organization name, it is a program name, so it's not in the funder registry. Lots of instances of authors citing programs rather than agencies. So lots of challenges in correctly matching this, and this is why in chorus discussion, funding agencies have been encouraged to tell their grant recipients how to cite correctly so that the publishers receive valid information. Also mentioned in chorus discussions, several publishers' journal articles have added a separate section for funding information, separate from the acknowledgements section. And that has made things clearer to the author what funding is versus what acknowledgement is, and it's significantly improved the extraction of funding metadata from those articles. It is a common practice to have author verification at the proof stage because there can be lots of corrections made during the production process. And again, showing the funder country name is important to confirm to the author. And a technical required practice is that we must robustly validate against the registry over and over again so that there is no risk of a name and an ID mismatch or a valid name with a missing ID, and so that the metadata is Crossref compliant as of deposit. The registry does change over time, so we have to keep in sync with that. So funding metadata quality has been a big challenge, and it is still an industry struggle. We added support for Crossref funding metadata in JATS 1.1 Draft 1 in December of 2013. The solution was similar to what we did for ORCID, a generic ID for institutions that could be used either for funding sources or author affiliations. So JATS 1.1 does now already support institutional IDs, which Chuck has mentioned as a new prospective project. In the Chorus Publisher Implementation Guide that I wrote, there's an appendix that gives examples of how to encode funding metadata in NLM 3.0, JATS 1.0, and JATS 1.1. Because when I did that 2 years ago, 1.1 wasn't approved yet, and there was still lots of publishers using NLM 3.0 and not even on JATS 1.0 yet. And so JATS 1.1 is just finally in an industry adoption. So it was an industry challenge that JATS 1.1 was in draft mode for 3 years. Many industry participants do not want to implement a draft standard, which is not unreasonable as drafts could change. So we on standards committees need to formally update standards much more quickly to best support these industry initiatives. So last point about funding, it has been looking interesting to see what publishers are doing with funding metadata in their article XML. I've seen 3 different locations: a metadata section in the front matter, a funding markup that's actually embedded in the acknowledgements section, or a separate back matter funding section, and combinations of these. And all of these are supported in JATS, but then you have to have a rule as to from where to pull the metadata from Crossref submission for Crossref submission. So here's some links to useful documents online, an important Crossref blog post about best practices for depositing the FundRef data, a talk at JATSCon this spring where Scott Deneen gave a talk on how he is using Schematron to validate his metadata for funding, and then the link to the Chorus implementation guide that I mentioned. So as we look at these 2 big examples and think about future metadata projects, it seems clear that a lot of the same workflow issues are likely to come up again. A key issue is the source. Is it author input or text extraction? And the process, is it manual or automated? I do suspect that in the future, machine learning technology and natural language processing technology will enable us to have some optimal automated solutions, but it may still need author confirmation. And thinking about the future vocabularies, such as institutional identifiers, the size and scope and evolution and maintenance is a critical challenge because the vocabulary has to be good, but it will change over time, which is a workflow issue. So the bottom line is the most important thing is industry collaboration. As I discussed in my talk on the history of publishing standards at SSP last month, the key for our success is that our community needs to be collaborative and proactive to support new projects, standards creation or updates, adoption and implementation in software and service offerings, so that new initiatives get done well and don't take for a very long time to become normal industry workflow components. But some of these projects can be tricky and evolve over time, so shared experience is a valid community activity, something that we do on the Chorus Technical Work Group and at the JATSCon, at the Crossref annual meetings, and on webinars like this. So I hope this was useful. Thank you, and on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much, Evan. Hi everybody, I'm Jennifer Kuhn. I'm with the Society of American Foresters. I am the Senior Managing Editor for SAF, and I'll be discussing the practical applications for these tools we've been hearing about today with specific regard to the perspective of the Society Journal Publisher. So I'll tell you a little bit about SAF and what we stand for. SAF is a membership society of around 12,000 plus members. We have a rich history. We were founded in 1900 and have published 5 journals since then. 2 of them are currently still being published. We published the Journal of Forestry, which has been around since 1917, and Forest Science since 1955. We previously had 3 regional journals that were focused on specific U.S. geographic areas, and in 2014 those folded into Forest Science. In addition to that, we also do publish books, and we're focusing on revamping our books program right now. But we also publish conference proceedings and other scholarly content. So as you can see, we care a lot about the rich history that we bring to the table for the people who are focused in forestry. And we care a lot about making sure that the publications we provide support the mission for the society and of special interest. SAF self-publishes all of our content. SAF's mission is here on the screen, and I've gone ahead and highlighted the important parts in red, and I think that a lot of this uses a lot of keywords that many other society publishers probably also see. Forestry is pretty much an important field to all of us, whether or not you think about it on a day-to-day basis, but it's easy to see how, whether we care about or think about this frequently or not, how properly managed forests and forest resources do actually impact our lives in so many different ways on a day-to-day basis. I'm personally reminded of that every time I read through the abstracts of the journals that I publish, but believe it or not, if you care about the price of orange juice or avocados at your local grocery store, or you care about the threat of global warming or wildfire, then you do in a roundabout way care about forestry as well. Technology is highlighted here as one of the keywords that I'd like to talk about a little bit more with regard to how a society's journals need to support its mission. That would include things like tools that we've discussed today, like DOIs, Authenticate, other things like altmetric and kudos, and several other tools that we won't get too much into today. But basically, better informed journal staff play into your society's overall mission, and having staff on your editorial team who are knowledgeable about the power of data and metadata and technology advances can help the journal, and then you can take that information and move it to the society's mission and bringing the society's goals ahead, which leads me to my next slide regarding important transitions. This year, SAF transitioned its journals from one editorial submission and peer review platform to another one, which was an incredibly daunting task due to the overwhelming number of moving parts and things that could potentially go wrong. But we took this as an opportunity to reevaluate what we were collecting in terms of metadata at the time of author submission, and even during the reviewer comments and submission. What kind of information did we want to keep? What kind of information did we want to change when we moved from one platform to another? And also, what did we want to have access to in the future once we closed the doors on our old platform? So these were all questions that we kept in the back of our minds. What we ended up doing was kind of extracting data out of our old system and uploading it into the new one as much as possible so that we wouldn't lose access to any of that rich historical information. And I would advise anybody who is going through a transition to this where you're hopping from one peer review platform to another, take special care to do something like that because you don't want to lose access to that important information. This year I also wanted to kind of make a push with our journal contributors to sign up for and use ORCID IDs. We're not seeing a lot of that right now, and there's one specific area of reasoning for why we think this is happening. Earlier this week, I was able to speak with our senior research fellow, Dr. Richard Golden, here at SAF, and we talked a little bit about why we think our contributors are shying away from the use of ORCID. We're not really sure, unfortunately, but we have a few ideas about this, the top one being that our contributor base is pretty much moving toward retirement or in retirement. So they're not really as focused on career level publication as a priority to them. This is just one of our observations, and we can't say with certainty that that's the #1 reason. But one thing we do hope to do is to launch a communication plan this year with our contributors to ask them to participate more with the use of ORCID and hopefully outline the benefits of that to them. This is just a quote that I really like, and it kind of plays in with the kind of logic and reasoning for why information and data is so important to us in scholarly publishing right now. Why do we care so much about having good data? This is some of the really dream information that I think all good editors want to have easily accessible to them. Having easy and reliable access to this information and really having data you can actually trust is a huge priority for publishers. I'm sure several people on this webinar today have experienced the same struggle with conflicting reports or perhaps untrustworthy data, but it's really the responsibility of us as society publishers to make sure that we are capturing the cleanest possible data right out of the gate, especially at the time of author submission of information into manuscript systems. Otherwise, down the line, when it comes time for us to start our reporting, for annual meetings or board of directors reports and things like that, we won't really be able to depend on our information. There's a popular saying right now, the struggle is real, so we do feel that from time to time. The metadata should also be looked at as an opportunity to inform the society's direction strategically on a wider level outside of the publications realm themselves. We like to be reminded of or also explore ways to understand what our stakeholders want to know. So we can look at things like keywords used in submissions that were accepted, rejected, as well as search terms used in the final published literature. We also like to look at the submission data. One of the key things that I'm interested in right now is the country of origin for submitting authors, because that could potentially tie in with some larger goals we have with growth in specific geographic areas. And then also of interest, societies also care a lot about their volunteer workforce. For peer reviewers, those tend to kind of be among the top or one of the top bases of volunteer labor for the society, which is important to note. For SAF, our journals tie back into the society's mission in a lot of different ways. If we can look into the back end, not just at what's been published, but also what's been submitted, to see what the decision was for those manuscripts and what the corresponding topics were, maybe what we can do with that information is take it to our managers table where we have discussions about how to plan out initiatives for the coming year, things like educational content for our annual meeting or blog posts that we may be developing, or even new book ideas or webinar concepts and more things like that. And it can help us really glean where we may want to enhance our focus or where we may want to sort of decrease some of our efforts just based on what we see people being interested in learning more about. Then post-publication, there's also a few things that we like to keep an eye on as well. Full text downloads and pay-per-view accesses. And some of the other metrics shown here are other indicators that aren't just pertaining simply only to article level success, but also this information can be useful, once again, as I outlined previously, to cross-cut through other departments outside of your publications team to be a driver of both revenue as well as a way to achieve the mission of your society, which is, after all, what we are all here for at the Society's office for the publications. And that's really it for me. Thank you for your time, and everybody. And at this time, I'll turn it back over to Dennis.
Thanks, Jennifer. That was great. I really appreciate it. And now we'll quickly, and to all the speakers, great job. But we'll turn to some questions here now that we have a couple minutes left. So my first question that I'll turn out to, maybe Chuck or Evan, you'd be the best for this, but the question is, how can some of these metadata lessons be useful or applied for book publishers like nursing, education, tax, and health professions? Any thoughts on that?
Well, just from the point of view of what's needed for metadata for books, it's really no less than for journals. And so the problem for books is equal to the problem for journals. People really need to collect a lot of metadata, the same metadata for their chapters and for the book titles themselves. And so I would just say that books are not that much different than journals, and they really should receive equal treatment from a metadata perspective.
Yeah, I would agree with that on the core. I would agree with that on the core metadata, but there is a lot more in the metadata world for book publishing. I've recently joined the EPUB working group, and it's just been really interesting to hear how different the book publisher challenges are from the journal publishing, and that they're wanting to move all of the metadata externally from the content because they update it frequently. But that's a lot about sales and marketing kinds of metadata. But what we're talking about, the identifiers, would apply equally well to books, authorship.
I see, thanks. So here's a question for Chuck. You had an interesting slide about participation for ORCID. The numbers weren't quite what you'd like, but you're hopeful. In a nutshell, what are some of the priorities for Crossref in terms of getting greater participation, and any, I don't know, message that you'd offer to publishers on that?
So there's two things, two ends of that. One is getting publishers to participate and include the ORCID in their submittal to Crossref. And I think there's plenty of movement underfoot, as Evan pointed out, that collecting ORCIDs is going to become a mandatory feature. And I think what we will do is encourage authors or publishers to collect ORCIDs and send them to us. So if you're not collecting an ORCID right now and including it, I think the day is coming when you really have to start doing that. The other problem is on the other side. So when we contact a researcher and ask for permission, and converting that request for permission into an actual grant of permission is a challenge. And I think ORCID is, as an organization, is going to have to really get involved in this as well, because what we're seeing happen is we reach out to researchers and we just don't hear back from them. And so researchers are getting ORCIDs, and then the question is, how much attention are they paying to their profile? I think we're going to have some outreach, and we're going to have some conversation with the researcher community, with the authorship community, and academic institutions to kind of explore what is the perception, the perceived value of ORCID.
I see. Thank you, Chuck. And Evan, for working with a variety of publishers, what are some of the biggest barriers you see in terms of wider adoption of metadata, and is there any advice you'd give listeners that are trying to promote the adoption of metadata in their organization?
Well, from an industry point of view, it's that all of the pieces of the workflow have to be in sync. It's the peer review system, the production system, and the hosting platform, because for many publishers, it's the hosting platform vendor service that is doing the Crossref registration. So and on the Chorus project, it's been clear all of our initial successes were primarily customers who were doing their own hosting, and we're just now finally getting the hosting vendors finishing implementing and things. So that was my point about the whole industry needs to collaborate. We need Crossref and the standards and the production service vendors, the peer review systems, and the hosting vendors. If we can all implement and deploy together, that is essential to eliminating these delays.
Thanks, Evan. Well, we are running out of time, so we are going to have to wrap up things soon. We'll try to gather some of the links of some of the reference points and resources and make those available either in a follow-up email or otherwise. But I also want to encourage folks to download the free white paper, which covers a lot of these points that Synveo Publisher Services has made available. That's available in the research widget there. on your console. It's called All Things Connected: 5 Factors Affecting the Scholarly Publishing Workflow. I want to thank our speakers, Jennifer, Chuck, and Evan, for sharing their insights with us today. And on behalf of Publishing Executive and Book Business and Senveo Publisher Services, I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. Be sure to check back on our webinar page to get information on all our archived and upcoming webinars. And if you would take just a minute to fill out the brief feedback survey that will appear on your screen next, we would be very grateful. Your feedback will influence the webinars we bring to you in the future. I hope to see you at the next Publishing Executive or Book Business webinar. Thank you.